The other thing that I find kind of interesting with Mr. Starmer is that many, many years ago, back in the 1870s, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was asked by a British journalist, what would you do if the British Army landed on the North Sea coast of Germany? And he said, well, that's simple. I'd have it arrested. And of course, his point was that the British Army was so small, it posed no real threat. Britain had a great navy, and that obviously could be threatening, especially if they were blockaded, which Bismarck understood. But I think, unfortunately, at this stage of the game, the British Army is emasculated to the point where no one takes it seriously. Starmer, I think, has embarrassed himself. And I'm sure Mr. Trump knows that. But the principal ice that's being broken is this hostility between Russia and the United States. For that, I think we should all be grateful. And from this point forward, we can move into a whole number of areas, not just resolving this tragedy on the ground in Ukraine, which frankly should never have happened. That's going to be resolved. But also we can get back to some useful discussions on nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities. And I think Mr. Trump has already hinted at that. So all in all, this is good news. The question for President Trump is, how do you move ahead with the Europeans? I think that Mr. Trump has been subject to insults and offensive remarks, and I'm sure that that continues to grate on him. But he does know that Europe has to play a role. How that's going to unfold, how that will be done is right now unanswered. You can't have a new security architecture in Europe that involves Russia and the United States unless the Europeans are involved. Now, I'm sure that there's an expectation that many of the people currently in power in Europe and in the United Kingdom will be gone shortly, that there will be elections and new people will be swept into power. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily anticipated in Great Britain, but it certainly is in Germany and I suspect France and other countries. They are almost always nationalists, or certainly more nationalist in their thinking, which is not aggressive and offensive. It's a kind of nationalism that says we want to preserve our country. We want our own culture, our identity, our language. Those things need to be protected, and we want peace abroad. In other words, prosperity at home and peace abroad, which I think we all support. I certainly do, and I know the Russians do. That will work itself out. I think Ukraine, in many ways, is a metaphor for globalism. What you're talking about is a generation of globalist leaders in the post-war era who've come to power, and they have systematically, in my judgment, harmed their own societies and countries by introducing tens of millions of non-Europeans into the countries which could never be absorbed and would never assimilate, and pretending that somehow or another this is a good thing. And this is the sort of lying that has gone on about what the true state of affairs is. And I don't need to tell you, in Britain, you know all about this sort of thing. I think that's also what Ukraine is about. In other words, it's not just Ukraine. The entire fantasy, globalist fantasy, is going to go down hard. And that's why there's a fight against it. It's also why, Starmer and his friends are all going to be gone, because they're raging against the storm like King Lear. They have no chance of success. It's over. And you mentioned something that's very important. If we were to bring in a sample of Germans and Frenchmen, I would even argue Poles, along with a sample of Scots, English, and Welshmen, we would discover they all want peace. They're not interested in war against Russia. Now, they've been lied to, and increasingly it's become obvious that that's not to say the place is perfect and utopian any more than the United States is. We all have flaws. And I think we're finally entering an era where we can be honest about each other. Because again, remember, Russia always stood for the opposite. Russia is an Orthodox Christian country with an ancient culture and makes no apologies for that any more than we should in our countries. But the Russians have been very strident about that. And I think there was a decision that somehow or another Russia had to be destroyed or fatally injured so as to preserve the cause of globalism, the end of borders, the end of peoples, the amorphous mass of people that were supposed to emerge and replace all of us who call ourselves something. I think that's part of the problem. And so I think if you keep that in mind, we're going to have peace. Eisenhower once said at some point, the peoples of the world, he was speaking specifically about Europe and the United States, are going to demand it. They're going to say an end to this nonsense. I think we're pretty close to that right now, and I think that's a very good thing. We've been backing that under the guise of democracy has nothing to do with democracy or human rights. You have a much better chance of a fair trial in Russia right now than you do anywhere in Ukraine. And I'm not saying that the other is radically better or worse. I'm just pointing out that all of this is catastrophic, and you're right. I don't think very many people in England understand it. I don't think very many people in the United States understand it. I think the Anglosphere is really being inundated with these lies, and now people are suffering from cognitive dissonance. You go in and say, well, that's not true. By the way, it never was. And they look at you like, how could that be? I heard it on the BBC. I heard it on CNN. And, even Germans were, until quite recently, I would say, have you learned nothing from your history? Why do you believe anything the government tells you? I was raised in this environment where if the government said it was probably a lie anyway. Nobody trusted it. And understandably, as you point out, from the very beginning, all of this was aimed at the destruction of Russia for the reasons we discussed. It's a combination of greed and hate based on the fact, first, this is a nationalist, Russian Orthodox Christian country, and Russia is rich in resources. And many of the vulture capitalists that were there in the 90s and then were thrown out by Putin wanted to come back, divide up the country, and rape it for all that they could get out of it. I came from a family where you tried to get us to wear a seatbelt. I was in Sweden, and this person said to me, we need to put your seatbelt on. I said, why? He said, well, because the state tells you that. And I said, why? Because the state made a study and determined it was good for you. People have to go back to thinking for themselves. That's hard because people are busy. They don't have time to study things. But alternative media, people like you, are very important because you are out there and you're increasingly being vindicated by what's happened. You're telling the truth. Eventually, it will have an impact, and even the BBC will have to give way. But between now and then, we still have some traveling to do. The thing that really upset me, because I spent most of my adult life studying and trying to understand Central East Europe, particularly, I used to be asked, what did you study in graduate school for your PhD? And I used to laugh and say, I studied Germans and Russians. Go figure, that's it, because those are the two dominant peoples in the region around which everything turns. And people don't understand how deep the wounds of the Second World War were in the East. Far, far deeper than anything we can imagine in the West. That was a terrible war. And you didn't have much freedom of choice. You either were on one side or the other, or you were just dead. And lots of people chose National Socialism over communism. And, we consigned a lot of those people to execution after the war at the hands of Stalin. Terrible mistake. People did what they had to do to survive and fought for what they thought was closer to their interests. It was over, and we hoped that it was over. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we see these symbols come back. And it inspires a new generation of Ukrainians whose ancestors fought for what they thought was right. But those things have nothing to do with reality today. I think the Russians in particular, at this point in time, are not interested in nonsense. They're not going to take any sort of strategic hedge that President Trump or anyone else thinks they're creating seriously. They want an end to this. They're willing to sign an agreement with us. They're interested in a security architecture for Europe, Russia, and the United States. We need to take that very seriously. This should be seen as a strategic inflection point in the history of Europe and, frankly, the world. And we should treat it appropriately, very seriously. Sit down and work it out, however many months it takes, because this could set the stage for decades of prosperity and peace and stability. That is what everyone should now be interested in. Russia is interested in it. I think we are as well. All this sort of tactical nonsense or mispronouncements all needs to go away. In fact, frankly, Judge, there are too many people in this administration talking too much about everything. So the only answer I can give you is that I don't know, but this is another example of something that happened to him during his first term. He would issue an order, he would give direction, but then there was no follow-up to ensure that his orders and directives were obeyed. That may well be the case now. And of course, Secretary Hegseth is new to the Defense Department. He may be in a somewhat similar situation. I don't know. He would provide more aid if they provided mineral wealth
to the United States in some substantial form. Again, it makes no sense. All of the aid should stop immediately, not humanitarian aid, but certainly any form of military aid should stop immediately. Why would the Russians take us seriously for a second if we sustained it? We need less of this marketing ploy, less nonsense, and more facts. And those facts should come from the president and not from anybody else. And they should come, I would say, only when absolutely necessary and carefully constructed after much research and understanding. That obviously is not the case. One of the things that could have been done that wasn't, and by the way, I understand how President Trump feels. You have to remember that when he was president during the first term, he was not treated well by the Europeans. And I think that there's a lingering sense of hurt and anger over that. And I wouldn't be surprised about it, especially when you look at this man Starmer and to a lesser extent at the French government. At this point, the Europeans, instead of seeing which way the wind is blowing and understanding that this war is going to end, and it's not going to end the way they want it to, it's going to end the way Moscow wants to end it. And we're prepared to accept that because, after all, they live there. Eastern Ukraine is next door. We don't. And we respect their wishes. I mean, that's really what President Trump has signaled. President Trump has a lot of influence. And I don't want to go into detail, but he can make it very clear what we will not do in the future if they do not cease and desist. Now, it would have been nice had the delegation that we sent to Saudi Arabia essentially decamped and went to Berlin, Paris, and London to address the Europeans in those governments directly and say, this is what we've discussed. This is what we have agreed to in principle. And this is what we're going to do next. That would have been helpful. We really didn't do that. And I understand why. And if the Europeans aren't going to get on board, there are a lot of things that can be done immediately behind the scenes that could be, let us say, detrimental to the political careers of the people that are currently sitting in power in these capital cities. And President Trump knows that. And it's up to him whether or not he feels that he's got to do that to make his influence felt. Remember, Eisenhower had a disagreement with the British and the French and the Israelis in 1956. He made his influence felt, and everyone withdrew and got on side. We're still, vis-a-vis Europe, that powerful, and they know that. And it's in their interest to work with us, not against us. So Rutte needs to go. He should resign. And so should these people in London and Paris if they're not going to do what's in the best interest of their country. Again, all you have to do is look at the opinion polls. Remember that Vice President Vance made the issue. They're acting against the will of their people. He's absolutely right. The opinion polls are obvious. There's no one chomping at the bit in Northumberland or Wales or Cheshire, can't wait to get on the airplane, put on a uniform, and fly to Ukraine. I don't see anybody in Provence or the Vendée or anywhere in France that wants to do it either. So it's time to stop the nonsense. It's time to get back to business. And after all, rebuild the economies, which are now shattered as a result of these stupid policies. It's not the Russians that are standing in the way of that. They are standing in the way of it themselves.
And one of the things that I said that got everybody's attention, which I fear is true, is that the average housewife in India has more gold now. I mean, collectively, if you got all the housewives in India together, they have more gold than the Bank of England. And I think what we're going to find in London and in New York, that much of the gold that we assume is there is not there. And it's not just Fort Knox. I mean, Fort Knox is one repository. There's a lot of gold under the streets of New York. And we don't know what has happened because the people that have been in charge of the Fed have really operated without effective oversight. And it may turn out that most of it is there. I hope so. There are all sorts of shady deals behind the scenes that have been going on for decades. This is what Dr. Ron Paul has talked about for years. That's why when he was a member of Congress, he wanted to audit the thing. And of course, everybody just laughed at him. I don't think people are laughing anymore. I think you've got a problem. We have a problem. We need to find out what it is, because if you look at where the gold is accumulating, well, that's obvious. Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. It's been migrating into those countries. Why are they hoarding gold? And at the end of the day, what good is our fiat currency if it's not backed by something substantive? People complain about BRICS, but at least if you join BRICS, you know that it's going to be backed by gold, the currency. So your trades are meaningful, and they're working hard to develop that. What are we going to do? I don't know, but I'm very worried. But I know that the German Republic, the Federal Republic, asked to have its gold repatriated to Berlin. Well, they only got 40% of what we held. Where's the rest of it? And Merkel shut up about it. She didn't complain anymore. Suddenly, okay, 40% is enough. Where's the other 60% of the gold that we owe the Germans that is supposedly in New York? I don't think the monster of globalism is going to win anything. I think it's probably going to die quickly. The problem for us, of course, as you know, is the financial system. And we're in a lot of trouble in the United States. We have this national sovereign debt that has reached monstrous proportions. There is no plan to deal with it. That's another issue. I know that privately, both when he was president and when he was running for president the first time, President Trump brought this up and was told by everybody, "Oh, don't mention that. Don't mention that. Don't mention that. That's problematic." Well, here we are. People have, refused to mention it. We are now trying to find evidence for all sorts of waste, fraud, and abuse and spending in Washington. Well, that's easy. You can find that all over the place. We can't even audit the $1 trillion Pentagon budget. Nobody knows where all the money goes. We haven't even talked about the intelligence organizations. And you had a similar crisis that ultimately helped to bring down Liz Truss, because she walked in and said, "I'm going to be the new Margaret Thatcher." I think a lot of people said, well, Trump's going to come in and be the new Ronald Reagan. Can't do it. This is, an entirely different world. He's finding his way through this. He's appointed people to deal with it, which is a very positive thing. But the problem is they'll never harvest enough savings to make any difference to this gargantuan debt, unless you go after entitlements and other things, and then you can demonstrate to your creditors that you're serious. I mean, you're in a very similar position, and we have to watch carefully. We call them treasury bonds, you call them gilts. Watch those markets, because that's the real barometer. And as that percentage on our U.S. Treasury reaches 5%, when it hits that 5% ceiling, all bets are off, because we can't service the debt any longer.
The future is bright if we're willing to step back and look at things differently. And by the way, we may have to get smaller first. And everybody resists this. Well, we have to have X number of hundreds of thousands of troops or we're at risk. Wait a minute. Not necessarily. We're not facing imminent existential threats from Russia or China. That's a lot of malarkey. We know that's not true. Our problems are largely south of the border and inside our own country. Now, we can deal with those, but we need to build a really good professional army. And that army needs probably to become smaller. And once you make it clear that we're not going to send people on pointless missions to places in the world that have no chance whatsoever of ever developing into societies like our own, but are going to wallow for many, many years in confusion, which is, by the way, their right to do. They have a right to their own culture, a right to the way they live. It's not our business to influence that. If we can accept that and get out of this, then I think we can build a very fine professional force that can do all of the things that we really need. The other point is we got to get out of this business of assuming the future will look like the past. The Army generals cling to all of this overseas presence, just like the Navy, the Army, the Marines, and the Air Force. If they lose their overseas presence, then what do? Well, how about defend the United States of America? I can come up with a good rationale for 500,000 troops, most 90% of whom are here inside the United States. They may be organized differently, may be equipped differently, and be capable of different things. But we have problems here inside the country, and we have them on our borders. The Army has a role to play. We need to look at our Guard and Reserve, and they need to mirror, in many respects, the regular Army. We've lost touch with all of these things, and we've worn a lot of people out. We've driven a lot of talent out. We've got to sit down and get back to basics and understand that our borders need protection, and we may have to fight in our hemisphere, not just along the border, but in other places. That's different from what we've been doing. And the same thing holds true for the Marine Corps. But the notion that we should be prepared to go thousands of miles away from home and conduct campaigns on the scale of World War II, Korea, Vietnam, or finally Desert Storm, and what we've seen over the last 20 years is absolutely ludicrous.
I think the second part of this that's very important for us to understand is that we've been running on fumes for a long time. You said something that's very accurate. We are bankrupt. We were actually bankrupt when Nixon went off the gold standard. And his objective then was to do it temporarily. And like so many other things in Washington, what begins as a temporary expedient ultimately becomes a permanent feature of government. So that's the other problem. So, we are bankrupt. And as I try to point out to people, when did the British leave India? When the GDP was 240% GDP ratio. The ratio of GDP was 240% of national income in Britain. And, at that point, it was unsustainable. The British left when they were broke. They had to go. Well, we're pretty close to being broke right now. And that's why I think you're finally beginning to hear serious talks about us withdrawing and pulling out of places, because everything with us is mortgaged to vanity, just as it was at the end of the British Empire. Everybody liked to look at the empire and congratulate themselves on how great they were. They fought all through the Second World War ostensibly to retain the empire, and what happened? They lost everything. Now, that's another problem. Well, there are two things to consider. First of all, John Kenneth Galbraith, a brilliant economist who served presidents from FDR all the way through to Carter, he once said that forecasting exists to make astrology look professional. So in other words, write off whatever the economists are telling you most of the time. They have no more idea what's going to happen than the man who's trying to sell you stock in the stock market. He really doesn't know what's going to go up or down and doesn't really understand how it works either. He's just trying to make money. So that's the first thing. But that's where we are, I think, at this stage of the game. And I think privately, President Trump probably understands that. And for him, and I feel badly about this, I'm very worried about what can happen over the next 6 months in the economy and with the financial system, because he happens to be president now. And just like Herbert Hoover had nothing to do with the Depression at all, he just happened to be president. And he became the target of abuse for everybody. I worry that could happen to Donald Trump. Right now, we have a kind of honeymoon here where everybody is happy and cheering on Donald Trump. And I certainly do. I'm glad he's doing what he's doing. But I do worry about what's coming in the future. And I do think you are going to go down ahead of us. And don't forget, the dollar has an enormous importance in Europe. So what happens in Great Britain, what happens in Europe is going to come to us. In other words, we're all on this sinking ship, if you will, together.
But the world is going to be different. And we've talked about that. We're talking about regional actors now coming to the fore. We see great power civilizations like Iran, India, China roaring back into focus and playing a role in the world. We need to get out of this business of thinking that we are the indispensable power. We aren't. The only thing that's indispensable to us is what we do here at home. We need to think of ourselves in those terms and stop wasting money, resources, and capabilities elsewhere. And if we are going to have alliances in the future, and I'm one of these people that thinks we should have little, what I would call, LLCs, limited liability partnerships with other countries. In other words, let's cooperate for this purpose. When that purpose is at an end, the cooperation doesn't need to completely end, but it certainly should end in a military sense. And I think we have to back up from all of this and rethink what we're doing and who we are. It's very difficult because, the biggest problem, Dan, this will disrupt, if not end, the money flow. And how do you justify all these crazy things if you're not going to get any money for it? Well, you're not. And I think President Trump has already talked about that when he said we'll cut our defense budgets in half. Obviously, he doesn't realize how much less everybody spends than us. And the same thing is true with others. In other words, let's not fall into this trap that we've been in for so many years of trying to create these alliances that live on a hair trigger, designed to fight somebody somewhere. And then when they no longer have that mission, we try to breathe new life into the comatose body of the alliance like NATO, and then use it for our purposes someplace else. Remember, NATO's either out of area or out of business. Well, I don't think most of those Europeans wanted to go out of area at all. So what have we done to them? Nothing good. But I think the Doge crowd is going to find that out. I don't know how much will work because, again, first you have to change the strategy, then you build a new structure. This is the time for that. This is the ideal time in the history of mankind for us to do that. We don't want to miss it. I think President Trump can achieve that with the Chinese, particularly if it works with Moscow. I think that opportunity will present itself. Right now, people don't understand in the United States that most people beyond our borders want nothing to do with a war. They just don't. If you visit China, you visit Korea, visit Japan, and see the monumental buildings these people have created, the societies that they've created. They're very different from us, but they work. They're very good. They're very effective. They're not interested in putting all of that at risk. Anybody who thinks so is absolutely deranged.